She was wearing white. The flowers in her hands were trembling, and the dog she had trained, the dog she had trusted with her life for 6 years, was sitting in the middle of the aisle blocking her path and refusing to move. Everyone in that chapel was watching. The groom stood at the altar, confused. The guests shifted in their seats. Her maid of honor leaned in and whispered, "Grace, just push him aside." But Grace couldn't move either, because Rex, her police dog, her partner, the animal, who had never once disobeyed her in 6 years of service, was staring up at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't play. It was grief. And the moment she looked into his eyes, she understood something that would break her open right there. In front of everyone she loved, in the middle of the most important day of her life, what Rex knew that morning, what he had been trying to tell her for weeks, would change everything. Not just the wedding. Everything. If this story already has your heart in your throat, take a second and hit that like button. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And before we go any further, drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. These stories deserve to travel. Part 2, the backstory. Grace Whitmore had never planned to join the police force. She had studied literature at university. She had wanted to write novels. She had spent 2 years after graduation waitressing in a small coastal town, filling notebooks with stories that never quite found their ending. But then her younger brother Marcus was hurt in a robbery, a senseless, violent thing that left him with a limp and her with a burning need to do something. Anything that pushed back against the darkness she had seen close up. She applied to the police academy on a Tuesday morning in November, half convinced they would reject her. They didn't. And the woman who graduated 2 years later bore little resemblance to the quiet girl who had filled notebooks with unfinished stories. She was leaner, sharper, more deliberate in her movements. She had learned to read rooms and people with the same attention she once gave to pages. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, it was the decision, made over and over again, to keep going anyway. She was assigned to the K-9 unit in her 3rd year on the force, which surprised her. She had never considered herself a dog person. She liked dogs the way most people did, from a comfortable distance, with appreciation but not obsession. But her sergeant said she had the right temperament, steady, patient, attentive. He said the best K-9 handlers weren't the loudest officers in the room. They were the ones who listened. Rex came to her as a 2-year-old German shepherd with a reputation for being difficult. He had already cycled through 2 handlers at the training facility. He was brilliant, everyone agreed on that, but he was particular. He needed a specific kind of person, and he had not yet found one. The trainer who introduced them warned Grace not to take it personally if Rex rejected her. Some dogs just don't click with certain people, he said. It's not a reflection of you. Rex sat in the center of the training yard and watched her walk toward him with the measured stillness of an animal that has learned to be cautious. Grace stopped a few feet away. She didn't reach out her hand. She didn't crouch down and make the high, coaxing sounds people usually made around dogs. She just sat down on the ground, crossed her legs, and waited. She looked away from him, out toward the fence line, and let him decide. For 7 minutes, nothing happened. The trainer watched from across the yard, arms folded. Then Rex stood, walked to Grace, and placed his head in her lap. The trainer said he had never seen Rex do that before. Grace didn't say anything. She just rested her hand gently on the top of the dog's broad, warm head and felt something settle inside her that she hadn't known was unsettled. Their training was long and exacting. Scent detection, crowd control, building searches, evidence recovery, pursuit protocol. Rex mastered every exercise with a focused intensity that Grace came to recognize as his version of joy. He didn't wag his tail the way other dogs did. Loose and easy. When Rex was happy, he worked harder. When Rex trusted you, he gave. Everything. And everything, it turned out, was extraordinary. On duty, they were exceptional together. There was a missing child case in their second year. A 6-year-old girl who had wandered from a park and couldn't be found for 11 terrifying hours. Rex tracked her scent through 2 neighborhoods, across a construction site, and down into a drainage channel where she had fallen and twisted her ankle and lay cold and frightened in the dark. Grace climbed down after him and found the girl curled around Rex like he was a blanket, his big body pressed against hers to keep her warm. There were harder cases too. Cases that didn't end well. Cases that stayed with Grace in the quiet hours after her shift, that lived in the spaces between sleeping and waking. Rex seemed to sense these nights. He would move from his bed to the foot of hers and lie there without being asked, a warm, solid weight that said, "You are not alone in this." People at the precinct liked to joke that Grace and Rex were the same person in different bodies. They had the same walk, unhurried but purposeful. The same stillness when they were reading a situation. The same absolute loyalty once trust was given. Grace would laugh when people said it. But privately, in the part of herself she rarely showed anyone, she thought they were probably right. She met Daniel at a fundraising dinner for the department's K-9 unit. He was a civil engineer. Tall and a little awkward in social settings. With the kind of quiet intelligence that revealed itself slowly, the kind you had to pay attention to notice. He had donated to the fund because his own dog, a border collie named Pip who had died the previous year, had been his whole world for 14 years. He wanted to do something. He wasn't sure what. They talked for 3 hours that night. Not about big things, not at first. About dogs, about grief, about the way certain animals understand us better than most people do. About what it means to be trusted completely. Grace found herself saying things she hadn't said to anyone. And noticing that Daniel listened the way she liked to be listened to, fully. Without rushing toward a response. They dated for 2 years. Daniel was patient with the irregular hours, the last-minute cancellations. The nights when Grace came home with that particular quietness that meant a call had gone badly and she needed time before she could speak. He never pushed. He learned to sit beside her the way Rex did, present, warm, unhurried. When he proposed, he did it in her apartment on a Sunday morning in January, no restaurant. No crowd, just the 2 of them and Rex lying across their feet on the kitchen floor. He said he had thought about making it more elaborate. He said he had almost booked a rooftop and a string quartet. But then he thought about what Grace actually valued, and he bought a simple ring and got down on one knee in the kitchen and asked. She said yes before he finished the sentence. Rex lifted his head and watched the whole thing. Then he set his head back down and went to sleep. The wedding was planned for early spring. A small chapel on the edge of the city. 40 guests. White tulips. No fuss. Grace spent exactly 1 afternoon picking her dress and the rest of her planning energy on the music and the food. Daniel handled most of the rest. They were good. That way, they divided the world evenly and trusted each other completely. Those months leading up to the wedding were some of the happiest Grace could remember. Not loud happiness, she had never been loud about anything. But the deep, quiet, reliable kind. The kind that feels like ground under your feet. She did not know, in those months, that something was wrong. She did not know that a shadow was gathering just outside the edge of her vision. Patient and silent, waiting for a moment she would never have chosen to face it. Rex knew. She just wasn't reading him yet. Part 3, The Crisis. It started 6 weeks before the wedding. And Grace almost missed it entirely. Rex had always been a dog of precise routines. He ate at the same times. He took the same paths on their morning runs. He had particular spots in the apartment he preferred, the corner of the living room with the afternoon light. The end of the hallway closest to the front door where he could
Monitor arrivals and departures. These habits were not compulsions. They were competence. Rex moved through the world with the deliberate architecture of an animal who had been trained to notice everything and waste nothing. So when he began sitting beside Grace and staring at her face in the evenings, she noticed. But she interpreted it wrong. She thought he was picking up on her pre-wedding anxiety. She thought, the way people always do when something unfamiliar begins, that it was nothing. Then he started nudging her with his nose. Not the playful nudge of a dog who wants attention, but a slow, deliberate press against her left side, her ribs, her arm, the same spot. Over and over. She pushed him off gently. He came back. She laughed about it to Daniel. He's being so weird lately, she said. Must be picking up on the stress. Daniel agreed. They moved on. The caterer called with a question about the menu. Grace's mother arrived for a weekend visit and filled the apartment with noise and opinions about centerpieces. The weeks continued their momentum toward the wedding, and Rex's behavior got filed under quirks to investigate later. Later came at 2 in the morning on a Wednesday, 3 weeks before the ceremony. Grace woke to Rex standing over her, his full weight pressing down on the left side of her chest. Not lying across her. Standing. Deliberate. She tried to push him off, half asleep. Irritated. He didn't move. She tried again, fully awake now, alarmed by how strange it was. He looked at her with those amber eyes and made a sound she had never heard from him before, not a bark, not a whine, something lower and more urgent, the sound of an animal trying with everything it has to communicate across the enormous distance between species. She sat up. She turned on the light. She looked down at her left side where he had been passing. There was nothing to see. But for the first time, she really put her hand there and pressed. And felt something that hadn't been there before. Small. Hard. Wrong. She sat in her car in the hospital parking lot for 20 minutes before she went inside. She had told Daniel she was going for an early run. She didn't know why she didn't tell him the truth. Maybe she needed it to not be true until a doctor told her it was. Maybe she needed to carry it alone for a little while before it became a thing that other people knew. The doctor who saw her was calm and thorough. She ordered an ultrasound. Then a mammogram. Then she sat across from Grace in a small consultation room with fluorescent light and folded hands and said words that Grace heard clearly and simultaneously could not absorb at all. Malignant. Early stage. Caught early, which matters enormously. But real. Present. Here. Grace drove home in a kind of silence she had never experienced before, not the silence of peace or of thought, but the silence of a world that has suddenly become unfamiliar. The streets were the same streets. The traffic lights were the same colors. But everything felt slightly off-register, like a film reel that has slipped a single frame. She sat in the parking space outside her building for a long time. Then she called Daniel. She heard his voice change as she spoke. She heard him trying to be steady for her while. Something inside him was clearly not steady at all. She heard him say he was coming. She heard the sound of keys, a door, footsteps. She sat and waited and watched her own hands on the steering wheel and thought about Rex, who had known before any doctor, before any machine, before any clinical word had been assigned to the small wrong thing inside her. She thought about how he had pressed and pressed and pressed, night after night. How she had called it anxiety. How she had called it quirks. How he had been trying to save her life and she had been pushing him off and going back to sleep. The diagnosis was breast cancer, stage 1, caught early enough to be treated aggressively and successfully in the vast majority of cases. The oncologist was warm and measured and honest. She laid out the treatment plan with a matter-of-fact precision of someone who does this every day and still understands that for the person sitting across from her, it is the first and most terrifying time. Surgery. Then a course of radiation. Monitoring. Follow-ups. The language of medicine applied to the body Grace had always relied on and never once thought to be afraid of. The wedding date was 3 weeks away. Grace and Daniel sat across from each other at the kitchen table that evening with Rex between them, the dog's eyes moving from one face to the other with an attentiveness that felt almost unbearable in its love. "We can postpone," Daniel said immediately. "We don't even need to discuss it. We postpone." Grace shook her head. She had thought about it the whole drive home. She had thought about it sitting in that parking lot. She had made a decision that was entirely hers and entirely right. "No," she said. "We don't postpone. I am not letting this take one more thing from me than it has to. We get married. And then we fight." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hands. Rex laid his head on top of both of them. They told no one else before the wedding. Grace's mother didn't know. Her colleagues didn't know. The 40 guests who would file into that small chapel on a Saturday morning in early spring didn't know. The only ones who knew were Grace, Daniel, and a German shepherd, who had tried every way he knew how to make her understand, and had finally, on a Wednesday night at 2 in the morning, been heard. Part 4. The Search and Waiting. In the weeks between the diagnosis and the wedding, Grace moved through
a kind of double life. On the surface, everything continued. There were final dress fittings and florist confirmations. And a rehearsal dinner at a small Italian place they both loved. There were toasts and laughter. And her brother Marcus making a speech that was 30% jokes and 70% genuine feeling. And Grace smiled through all of it with a warmth that was entirely real even as the other thing sat quietly at the center of her, like a stone she had decided to carry without complaint until the moment she could begin to put it down. She went to her pre-surgical consultation alone on a Tuesday morning while Daniel was at work. She sat in a beige room and listened to a surgeon explain what would happen and when. And she asked careful, specific questions. And she took notes on a small pad she kept in her jacket pocket. She was very good in that room. Very composed. She had spent years learning to be composed in rooms that asked it of her, she cried. In her car afterward. For exactly 12 minutes. She had allowed herself that. 12 minutes. Then she put the notepad in her bag, started the engine, and went back to work. Rex was different during those weeks. Not worse, if anything, he was more present, more settled. As though the crisis of the undiscovered thing had been resolved and now he could simply be near her. He stayed closer than usual on their runs, matching her pace precisely. Occasionally pressing his shoulder against her leg with a gentleness that was almost human. At night he slept at the foot of her bed. And she could feel his warmth through the blanket end. It helped more than she could have explained to anyone. She thought a lot, in those weeks, about what he had done. About the capacity of a creature who shares your life to know things about your body that you cannot know yourself. Dogs had been used in medical detection for years, she knew this academically. She had read studies, heard the occasional story. But to have lived it, to have had a 6-year-old German shepherd with a reputation for being difficult stand on your chest at 2 in the morning and refuse to move until you understood, that was something else entirely. That was not a study. That was a love so specific and so unglamorous. And so completely devoted that it had no name she knew. Daniel was remarkable during this time. He had always been steady, but these weeks revealed a depth of steadiness she hadn't fully known was there. He didn't crowd her with worry. He didn't make the diagnosis the subject of every conversation. He did the dishes every night without being asked. He booked her favorite takeout on the bad days and didn't require her to explain which days those were. He looked at her, sometimes, across a room, with an expression that said everything without saying a single word. I am here. I am not afraid. We are doing this. She loved him for it so completely that it occasionally frightened her, the magnitude of what she stood to lose, the size of the life she was fighting to protect. She had one conversation with her closest colleague, a woman named Patricia who had been On the force for 15 years and knew Grace better than most people did. Grace told her the day before the wedding, not everything, just enough. Patricia listened without interrupting. Then she pulled Grace into a hug that lasted longer than their usual efficiency permitted, and when she stepped back her eyes were wet and her voice was level. "You're going to be fine," Patricia said. Not as a comfort. As a fact. "I know," Grace said. And she meant it. She was afraid. She was also, in some deep and bedrock place, entirely certain. She had Rex's certainty to borrow from when her own ran short. The night before the wedding. She sat on the floor of her apartment with Rex's head in her lap. And her back against the sofa and the city humming quietly outside the window. Daniel had gone to stay the night at his brother's, keeping to the tradition that said they shouldn't see each other before the ceremony. The apartment was very quiet. "You knew," she said to Rex. She wasn't really talking to him, or she was. But she wasn't expecting an answer. She was just saying it out loud because it needed to be said. "You kept telling me and I didn't listen. But you didn't give up. You just kept going." Rex blinked. His tail moved once. Slow and certain. "I'm going to do the same thing," she told him. "I'm going to keep going." She stayed there on the floor for a long time. The city hummed. Rex breathed. The night passed around them both, steady and dark, preparing its slow way toward morning. Part 5, the reunion/turning point. The morning of the wedding was cold and bright. April light, thin and clear, the kind that makes everything look slightly more real than usual. Grace dressed at her maid of honor's house, her oldest friend. A woman named Clara who had known her since university and handled the morning with the precise emotional calibration of someone who understood that Grace needed competence, not fussing. There were mimosas. There was a playlist. Clara did her hair with the focused attention of someone doing something that matters. And Grace sat in the chair and felt against her expectations. Almost calm. Rex had come with her. He was not a working dog today, there was no harness, no badge. No operational purpose. He was simply her dog, allowed by the chapel on the specific and inflexible condition that he behaved himself. He had worn his best collar, black leather with a small silver buckle. And he sat against the wall of Clara's spare room and watched the preparations with his usual measured attention. At one point Clara said, "He keeps looking at you like he's worried." Grace glanced at him in the mirror. "He's always looking at me like that," she said. "That's just his face." But Clara was right. There was something in Rex's eyes that morning that was different from his usual watchfulness. Not alarm, he wasn't picking up any external threat. Something more internal. Something directed entirely at Grace, personal and tender in the way that animal love can sometimes be, which is to say more honest than anything else. The chapel was small and full of pale spring light. The 40 guests filled it easily, and Grace could hear the low warm hum of conversation through the door as she waited in the entrance hall with her brother Marcus, who was giving her away. He was holding her hand very tightly and pretending he wasn't nervous. She was holding his hand back and pretending the same. Rex was on her left side, unharnessed, close. The music began. The doors opened. And they stepped forward. Grace saw Daniel at the far end of the aisle and something in her chest expanded so quickly it almost hurt. That particular joy of seeing someone you love in a context that crystallizes why you love them, surrounded by everyone who matters. Waiting for you with a steadiness that is its own form of devotion. She took 3 steps. And Rex stopped. She felt it through the lead, not a lunge. Not aggression, just a slow, complete cessation of movement. Like a ship dropping anchor. She looked down, Rex was sitting directly in front of her, blocking her path. Looking up at her with those amber eyes that had first looked at her across a training yard 5 years ago and walked across and put his head in her lap and changed everything. Rex. She kept her voice low. The guests were watching. Daniel was watching from the altar, his expression shifting from joy to confusion. Rex, come on. He didn't move. Marcus tried a gentle tug on the lead. Rex turned his head and looked at Marcus with such calm authority that Marcus actually stepped back. Grace, Clara hissed from behind her. Just go around him. But Grace wasn't going around him. She was staring at Rex, and Rex was staring at her, and something was passing between them in the silence, not words. Never words, but the thing that exists beneath words. The older and more honest language that they had spent 5 years building between them. Her hand moved to her left side without her making a conscious decision to move it. The same place. The place he had pressed for weeks. The place she had finally listened to. And she understood. He wasn't stopping her. He was asking her something. He was asking, are you sure you're ready? Are you sure you're strong enough? Not for the wedding. For what comes after the wedding. For the fight. For the long thing. He was checking on her the only way he knew how, by making her stop. By making her be still for a moment in the middle of everything and look at him. Look at herself. The chapel was completely quiet now. 40 people holding their breath. Grace crouched down in her white dress, flower still in her hands, and put her palm flat against the side of Rex's face. He leaned into it. His eyes closed for a moment. She pressed her forehead against his. I'm ready, she whispered. I promise. I'm ready. Rex opened his eyes. He looked at her for one more long moment. Then he stood, moved to her side, and sat there quietly, and waited for her to lead. She stood. She straightened. She looked up the aisle at Daniel, who was watching her with an expression that had moved entirely past confusion into something she recognized as love in its truest and most complicated form, love that witnesses you fully and does not look away. She walked forward. Rex walked with her. And the chapel, quietly, without anyone deciding. 2. Filled with the soft sound of people crying. Part 6, The Reveal and Survival Mystery. She told them at the reception she hadn't planned to. The plan had been to wait, to let the wedding be a wedding. Uncomplicated by the other thing. And to tell people in the coming weeks as the treatment began and concealment became impractical. But standing in that small reception hall with the people she loved most arranged around her, still moved from the chapel, still warm with the particular energy of a ceremony that had been unexpectedly and deeply felt. She decided. The plan was wrong. She asked for the microphone after dinner. Daniel looked at her with a question in his eyes. And she held his gaze for a moment and he nodded. Understanding without explanation. Which was one of the reasons she had married him. She stood up and looked around at the faces, her brother Marcus. Her mother, Clara. Patricia. The colleagues and friends who had driven from across the city on a cold April morning. And she felt the particular courage that comes not from the absence of fear but from the decision that love is more important than protection. She told them everything. The nudging. The pressing. The Wednesday night at 2 in the morning. The hospital parking lot. The diagnosis. The plan. She told them with the same steadiness she had practiced for years. And she watched their faces change and she let them change because they were allowed to, because love requires the room to respond. She told them about Rex. About what he had done. About how she had almost missed it. Almost called it anxiety, almost gone back to sleep. And she turned to look at Rex, who was lying near the door with his head on his paws, monitoring the room with quiet professionalism, and she said, "He saved my life. Before any doctor. Before any machine. He saved my life and I want you to know that." The room was very still. Then her mother made a sound that was half laugh and half something else entirely, and Marcus put his face in his hands. And Patricia raised her glass without speaking, and somewhere in the middle of all of it Rex lifted his head and looked at Grace across the room. 3 times against the floor. Later, after the speeches and the dancing and the long gradual unwinding of the evening, Grace sat at a table near the window with Rex's head in her lap, the way she had sat on the floor of her apartment the night before, and her mother came and sat beside her. Her mother reached down and put her hand on Rex's back, and they sat like that for a long time without speaking. "How long have dogs been able to do this?" her mother asked finally. "Apparently a long time," Grace said. "There's research. Studies. Dogs that have been trained to detect it, dogs that have done it without any training at all. They smell something, a chemical change, something the body produces when cells become wrong. And some of them respond to it. Not all of them, but some." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "And Rex just knew." "Rex knew," Grace said. "From the beginning. He just needed me to stop long enough to listen." Her mother looked at the dog for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, "I'm going to buy him the best dog treats money can purchase." Grace laughed. Actually laughed, the real kind, unguarded, from the center of her. Rex's tail thumped against the floor. The night moved warmly around them. Part 7, Recovery and Emotional Climax. The surgery was scheduled for 3 weeks after the wedding. Grace had been told what to expect and had done the additional reading that people do when they are the kind of person who processes difficulty by learning everything there is to know about it. She was not afraid of the procedure itself. She was not afraid of the recovery. She was afraid, in the way that anyone who has been given a diagnosis is afraid, of the version of the future that involved the treatment not working, the cells not listening, the body not cooperating. She was afraid of the particular silence that would live in Daniel's eyes if things went wrong. She was not afraid enough to stop. She was afraid the appropriate amount, which is to say, enough to take it seriously, not enough to let it run. The morning she went in, Daniel drove and Rex sat in the back seat. Grace had been told the dog couldn't come into the hospital, which she had expected. She had said goodbye to him in the parking lot, crouching down in front of him the way she had crouched in the chapel aisle. Her hand on his face, their foreheads briefly together. "I'm coming back," she told him. Same as always. Rex held her gaze. Then he licked her chin, which he almost never did, and Grace laughed the surprised laugh of someone who has just been kissed by something they love entirely. And stood up and went inside. The surgery was successful. 4 hours, complete removal, clear margins, the language of medicine. 4, we got it all, we think. We are cautiously optimistic in the way that oncologists allow themselves to be when the numbers are good. The surgeon came out to Daniel in the waiting room and said the words that waiting rooms are built for, the words that change the quality of the air in a room in an instant. Daniel called Grace's mother. Then Marcus. Then Patricia. He sat in the waiting room with his phone and made each call in turn, and Grace could hear later, in the slight roughness that his voice carried for days afterward, how much effort those calls had cost him. How much he had been holding without showing. Recovery was slow and was also faster than expected, which is the particular paradox of healing. It is simultaneously too long when you are inside it and surprisingly brief when you look back. Grace was in the hospital for 2 nights. She came home on a Tuesday afternoon to an apartment that Daniel had filled quietly and without announcement, with white tulips. The same flowers she had carried in the chapel. Rex was waiting at the door. He stood and watched her come in with that grave attention he gave to important moments. And when she crossed the threshold and crouched down to him, he pressed himself against Her with a gentleness that accounted for the bandages and the soreness, and the particular fragility of someone who has been through something and come out the other side. She cried then. She had not cried much before, in the parking lot, after the consultation. Those 12 measured minutes. But she cried now, with her arms around her dog and her husband's hand on her back and the white tulips on every surface. And it was not the crying of grief. It was the crying of release, of coming home, of having survived the particular darkness that had gathered outside her vision and finding, on the other side of it, that the light was exactly as bright as she had remembered. The radiation began 6 weeks later. 5 days a week for 6 weeks, a routine that built itself into the fabric of her days with the persistence of all medical routines. She was tired in ways she hadn't been tired before, a deep cellular exhaustion that wasn't cured by sleep. She had nausea some days and appetite on others, and a new and specific relationship with her own body, a watchfulness, a gratitude that had not been there before. On the hard days, Rex lay beside her on the sofa and she read to him from her old notebooks. The unfinished novels she had written years ago. The stories that had never found their endings. She read him the words and he listened with the seriousness of a dog who has been told, more than once, that he is the reason she could be read to at all. The last day of radiation was a Friday in October. Daniel brought champagne and her mother came with the promised dog treats. The expensive kind from the artisan shop near her house. That came in a gold box tied with a ribbon. Rex accepted them with considerable dignity and ate 3 before Grace made him stop. Patricia came by that evening with a card signed by the entire unit. Grace read it in the hallway. And her throat tightened with something beyond gratitude. With the particular feeling of being known by people who have chosen to know you. The feeling of a community that holds. The first clear skin came in November. No evidence of disease. The oncologist said it with the same matter-of-fact precision she had used for the original diagnosis. Because she understood that the opposite of a devastating fact is also a fact that must be delivered clearly. Without sentimentality, so that it lands in the body with its full weight. Grace sat in the consultation room for a moment after the doctor left. She put her hand flat against her left side. She thought of Rex pressing his nose there, night after night. She thought of the small wrong thing that had been found and removed and treated into silence. She thought, I almost missed this. I almost called it anxiety. I almost went back to sleep. Then she stood up, put on her coat, and went to find her husband. Part 8, The Healing. The winter after was quiet and full. Not the hollow quiet of the months she had spent moving through a double life. Carrying the weight of the undisclosed thing. The other kind of quiet, the kind that exists when everything that needed to be said has been said and everything that needed to happen has happened, and you are left with the daily warmth of a life that has been fought for and won. Grace went back to work in January. Her return to the K9 unit was unceremonious by design. She had asked for no fuss and received none. Which was one of the things she valued most about Patricia and the rest of the team. She was back. She and Rex were back. That was what mattered. Their first call back was a routine missing person report. A teenager who had wandered from a school field trip and been found quickly. Cold and embarrassed and fundamentally fine. Not a dramatic return. Not a case that would make anyone's career highlight reel. But standing in the field with Rex working beside her. His nose to the ground, his attention complete and absolute and entirely on the task. She felt something slot back into place inside her that she hadn't known was misaligned. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Doing exactly what she was supposed to do. With exactly the partner she was supposed to have. Rex had a moment of his own. In that field, a moment Grace saw and would carry with her. For a long time. He found the scent trail, followed it through a stand of trees to where the teenager was sitting on a fallen log, and stopped. He looked at the kid. Then he looked back. At Grace. And she would have sworn, to anyone who asked, that there was something in his expression that was not operational satisfaction but something older and more personal. The look of an animal that has spent the last year frightened for someone it loves and is only now, finally, beginning to believe the fear is over. She crouched down and rubbed behind his ears and said, very quietly so only he could hear, "We're okay. Both of us. We're okay." His tail wagged. Fully, freely, the way tails do when the thing being communicated is entirely uncomplicated. The story got out eventually, the way stories do. Not because Grace told it, she had no interest in being a story, but because these things travel. Because 40 people had been in that chapel and heard what she said at the reception, and some of them knew people in the department, and the department is not, despite all best efforts, a place where extraordinary things remain secret for long. A journalist called. Grace declined, politely. A local morning show reached out. She declined. Again. But she did agree to speak, once. At an event organized by the hospital's oncology unit. A morning session for patients currently in treatment. People sitting in rows of chairs with that particular look that Grace recognized from her own reflection in the hospital mirror, the look of people who have been asked to be brave on a daily basis and are tired but still standing. She brought Rex. She told them the story simply. Without embellishment, the nudging, the pressing, the two. In the morning, the parking lot. She told them that she almost missed it. She told them, very carefully, that she was not suggesting they all go home and wait for their dogs to alert them to tumors. She was saying something different and she wanted to be precise about what that was. I'm saying that sometimes the people and animals who love us know things before we do, she said. And the kindest thing we can do for them, and for ourselves, is to stop long enough to listen. The room was very quiet. Rex lay beside her chair and several people in the audience watched him with the particular expression of people who are trying to hold themselves together and finding it difficult. A woman in the third row raised her hand. She was in her late 60s, Grace thought, with the look of someone who had been going through this for a while. The combination of weariness and deliberate cheerfulness that long-term treatment produces in people with a certain kind of spirit. Did he know he saved your life? She asked. Your dog. Does he know? Grace looked at Rex. Rex looked at Grace. The amber eyes. The same eyes that had watched her across a training yard and walked over and made a decision. The eyes that had pressed and pressed in the dark of a Wednesday night until she finally understood. I think, Grace said slowly, that he knew what mattered. He always has. The woman nodded. And something in her face, in the specific quality of her stillness in that moment, suggested that this was the answer she had needed, not information. Not data, but the simple confirmation that love does the thing that love is supposed to do, even when it can't use words, even when the person it loves is going back to sleep. Part 9, the ending. A year after the diagnosis, Grace and Daniel planted a garden. They had a small patch of outdoor space behind their new house. They had moved from the apartment in the spring, deciding that the life they were building together deserved a version of itself with more room. The garden was Daniel's idea. He had grown up around gardens, understood their particular patience, the way they ask nothing more than that you show up and pay attention. He thought Grace might like something that grew slowly and rewarded steadiness. He was right. She did. They planted in April, tulips, because of course, and lavender because Rex seemed to find it calming, and a rosemary bush by the back door that the previous owners had left and that Daniel thought they should keep because it smelled like something worth keeping. Grace. Planted on her knees in the early spring. Dirt with Rex watching from the patch of sunlight. Near the fence. Occasionally rising to investigate a smell and then returning to his post with the reassured expression of a dog who has found the world in order. She thought about what the year had been. She thought about the small hard thing that could have grown in the dark and unnoticed if not for a dog who had refused. Night after night, too. Let her go back to sleep. She thought about fear and the ways it can be held without being swallowed. She thought about Daniel and the specific texture of his steadiness and what it means to have chosen the right person to face the difficult things with. She thought about Rex. She thought about the training yard and the 7 minutes and the head in her lap. She thought about the first missing child case, the girl in the drainage channel, and about all the nights he had moved from his bed to the foot of hers without being asked. She thought about the Wednesday at 2 in the morning in the parking lot and the chapel aisle, and how a single creature, unable to speak, had rewritten the story of her life by simply refusing to give up on her. They have a framed photograph in the hallway now. The wedding photographer caught it. The moment in the aisle when Grace had crouched down and put her forehead against Rex's. In the photograph you can see her face and his face and the 40 guests visible behind them. Some watching, some already crying. And the pale April light coming through the chapel windows. The frame is simple. Below the photograph there is a card, in Grace's handwriting, that says, he knew. She has her 1-year clear scan in November. She will go alone, as she does these things, and sit in the beige room and receive the words that will tell her whether the year ahead is open or complicated. And she will carry whatever the answer is with the same steadiness she has been practicing all her life and practicing more deliberately in this last one. But she is not afraid. She knows the difference now between the things worth fearing and the things that only feel that way in the dark. She knows how to stop. She knows how to listen. She knows that love announces itself in whatever form it can find, and that the only catastrophe is in failing to pay attention. Rex is 7 years old. He still works. He is as fast and as focused as he ever was, and the trainers who watch him in the field still say what the first trainer said all those years ago in the yard: there is something particular about that dog. Something that operates on a frequency most animals don't have access to. Grace knows what it is. It is not a frequency. It is not even a gift, exactly. It is the pure and undiluted consequence of a love that has never asked for anything in return except to be heard. Every morning she wakes and Rex is at the foot of her bed and Daniel is beside her and the garden is growing in its quiet, patient way outside the window. And she takes a breath and she thinks, this is it. This is the whole thing. This is what all of it was for. She got lucky. She got a dog that pressed and pressed and pressed in the dark. She got a man who brought white tulips home from the hospital. She got doctors who were good at their jobs. And a body that fought back and a morning in April when she walked down an aisle in a white dress and the most important creature in her life stopped her for a moment and asked, "Are you sure? Are you ready?" And she was. And she is. And every day she carries that knowledge forward like a light in her chest, small and steady and absolutely hers. If this story reached you today, I want you to think about the people and animals in your life who are trying, in their imperfect ways, to tell you something important. The ones who press and press and press. The ones who refuse to let you go back to sleep. Listen to them. However you can. Whenever you can. Because sometimes love speaks in the only language it has, and all it needs is for you to finally be still. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below. I want to know, have you ever had an animal or a person in your life who sensed something was wrong? before you did. Has an animal ever changed your life in a way you couldn't explain? Tell me. I read every one.